because of you fools. We've been dancing with the devil way too long. I know it's fun, but get ready to pay your dues. Oh God, come back home. This crazy world is filled with liars and abusers. We need you now before we're too far gone. I hope one day they finally see the truth. God, we need you now.
Good evening, patriots, freedom fighters throughout Saskatchewan, across the country, and around the world. How we all doing tonight? So, Salim will be joining us here shortly, hopefully. As you probably saw by the title, we're going to talk a little bit nationalism versus globalism, and some good news on that front. But before we get into it, wait for Salim to show up. Tomorrow, though, really looking forward to this. Me and RB are back on the road again. Looking forward to it. We'll be at the E Center in Swift Current at 7 p.m. If you're in the area, by all means, come and join us. Come and say hello. Glad to get back in the saddle, and looking forward to being in Swift Current. We're also have another one scheduled for the 23rd of April in Esterhazy. Also looking forward to that one. So if you're in the Esterhazy area, anywhere from Yorkton to Moosomin or Estevan, come on up to Esterhazy and join us. That's on the 23rd of April. So looking forward to it. It's nice, really super nice to get back at it. Yeah. So anyways, Salim is here. I'll bring him on in and we'll get started with our chat. How are you, Salim?
Good evening, Mark. Very good.
Good to see you, my friend.
Thank you.
So I entitled this show Globalism versus Nationalism. I don't think it's the first time I've done that, but I think it's appropriate given some of the circumstances that we've seen with elections in Europe, Eastern Europe, and a few of those things that we should highlight tonight a little bit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is. The world is basically breaking up, splintering along that great divide that you and I have been talking about now for past several months, which is globalism on the one side and nationalism on the other. And the issues are becoming so much clearer, not only to among us, the people with whom we are speaking and to whom we are speaking and from whom we are listening to what their concerns are. But it is becoming clear right across the world. And in some ways, it is very exciting to see that finally the clarity and the sharp divide is now very much visible and taking shape. So it's very encouraging and in that sense very exciting. But everything of this nature is also fraught with hazards, with dangers, with peril. And that is, we went through 2 years of pandemic. It is not over. And that 2 years of pandemic was mental health tyranny and totalitarianism that was imposed upon us. That is, every crisis becomes an instrument or a pretext for the globalists, for the communists, for the the left wing, the deep state, to use that crisis to push the agenda of totalitarianism at the global level.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so that's the danger we are faced with right now because of the war in Ukraine. Again, I have to underline this matter for all of us um, who want to think clearly, critically, and historically, that this is the second major European war after the end of the Cold War. The first major European war, which now we can see, looking back at it after the Cold War in the mid 1990s, was the Balkan Wars in Europe. That is, the breakup of Yugoslavia into Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia.
Right.
And now the second European war that is going on, which is in Ukraine. So to keep that in mind, this is the European war, but it has very much a global dimension. In fact, it is at the heart of the globalist dimension. Just as in the first half of the last century, that is the 20th century, there was two world wars, World War I and World War II, which were European wars. It had nothing to do, say, with the people in Indonesia or Sri Lanka or South Africa or Argentina. It was a European war, but it had a global dimension. And
Right.
so we are back again into that situation that we need to discuss. But this past week has been a week of elections in Europe. Two
Yeah.
very important elections happened. One was in Hungary, and the other one was in Serbia. And this Sunday is the first round of the French election, the presidential election, which will be also a very significant and important election, whichever way the eventual result is.
Yeah, I actually I congratulated Orban on his re-election in Hungary. Yeah, extremely good news, and I think it was quite a landslide.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal victory. It was a crushing defeat of the six-party alliance that came together to stop Orban, supported by the globalists, in this case, the European Union, and George Soros and his oligarchs of the World Economic Forum. And Orban's party, Fidesz, was able to give a crushing defeat to the six-party alliance, winning, by the way, a fourth majority government. That is so astounding, you know. So he wins the fourth term.
But so there, Salim, in Hungary, you have a populace that is obviously very nervous about communism, very nervous about totalitarianism, globalism, and a populace that's very educated and aware. So it doesn't surprise me that in Orban, the way he governs his country, would get reelected. It doesn't surprise me in the least.
No, you and I are not surprised, Mark. But on the other hand, the surprise is the astounding defeat the people of Hungary delivered to the globalists. So that surprise means, at least for me, if I'm speaking here for myself, how is it that my fellow Canadians are like Rip Van Winkle in a 50-year sleep?
Right.
That they cannot wake up, they cannot smell the coffee, they do not want to understand what has happened to their country, to their families, to their children, and to their future. That is what is surprising, you know, a very big surprising.
But it's never happened. And so we're sort of mass ignorance, you know, in this regard, because we've never really had to deal with it. We've never really had to fight for freedom. We've never really had to fight for sovereignty. Although, our complacency has allowed it to drift away. But I think we're different than a lot of Eastern Europeans that have sort of, through their families, recognize what's coming and are more astute in recognizing it, whereas Canadians are somewhat oblivious and think it can never happen here. Well, guess what?
Well, Mark, I mean, this is the conversation we need to happen. We need to
Yeah.
have very seriously. There is the other discussion. So if we just carry on this track for a little while, it is very important. You and I both are saying Canadian, but look, you are a European Canadian, and if I understand from you, your background, it's a mix of East European and Northern European, Scandinavian background that you come
Well,
from.
yeah, my biology is Scottish, small percentage, and very heavy on the Norwegian end of things. But I was brought up, because I'm adopted, I was brought up Ukrainian and Dutch.
Okay, so there's a phenomenal collection of genes that you have in you, both in terms of your own personal DNA and in terms of the culture
Yeah.
that is European stock. And I am, as you can see, I have also a very mixed biological genes on my mother's side of the family. I have a European Scottish gene. My grandmother was a Scot woman,
Hmm.
born in India, married to my grandfather.
Hmm.
And so my
So we
mother
might be related, is what you're saying.
could be a Scot or in my case Scot Indian. In that is the context of my family background, and
Hmm.
also on my father's side there are some mixed relationship. Remember, the British, and I say British, not the English, because British meant, Irish, Scots, English, and Welsh,
Hmm.
were in India for over 200 years. And there
Right.
was a lot of, back and forth
Hmm.
exchange. But I'm an Indian, in the most fundamental sense,
Hmm.
Uh, and so the point I'm driving at is we are an immigrant country, Canada. And so there's a lot of Canadians who are of European background, but particularly of East European background, who came to Canada before or after the end of World War II. If they came before World War II, they were escaping from the situation in Europe that led to the crisis after World War One, the Depression, the rise of fascism in Europe, and so they were escaping from all of that. If they came after World War II, they were escaping. If they were from East Europe, they were escaping from Soviet communism, from Stalin, and all of that. So the
Hmm.
question then is, and a very serious question, um, what happened to the children, the grandchildren? How is it that they will vote for the liberals and the conservative who
Hmm.
are all about LGBTQ, who have given up on God, country, religion, family, which is what the whole election in Hungary is about,
Yep.
for resounding victory for Fidesz and Viktor Orban against all odds. I
Hmm.
mean, the Hungarians have stood strong, given their memory,
Yeah.
given their experience, historical experience from World War One all the way to now. So they have come back and they said, we want to be an independent nation state. We will protect our sovereignty. We will decide who we will allow into our country and who we will not. We will decide how we operate our economy, our business, our schools,
Yes.
our faith, our family, our neighborhoods. That is what sovereignty is about. It's about the people. And
Absolutely.
Viktor Orban has articulated that in a very powerful way. So my question then remains hanging. What happened to the Hungarians in Canada, to the Serbians in Canada, to the people who came from broken Yugoslavia, the Czechs, the Poles, what has happened to them? And of course, the third world country. But I can give the third world country explanation very simply. The people of the third world, particularly in Canada and in the United States, there's people of my background, that is Indians and Chinese and Africans and Caribbean. They came to Canada or they came to North America, whichever of the two countries they were able to come to, which opened their door and received them. They came because they were looking for economic, uh, you know, uh, advantages. They were looking for,
Right.
rising up economically from the background that they were coming in: third world economy, peasant economy, broken economy, and so on. And so for them to walk into Canada, to walk into the United States or France or England, is to take advantage of that economic opportunity that opened up to them and their children. And in return, they have supported the politics of, in so many ways, nothing but socialism, social welfare, so on and so forth. And in terms of their culture and religion, they did not belong in that sense to that framework of Christian values. Even if there were people who were Christian, as India has a large Christian population, or Middle East has a large Christian population, but the social cultural values were not defined in that sense, as is the European culture was defined as Christian. And so they were, in that sense, outsider. And the question was whether they can assimilate into North American value system, to which the Europeans were part of that North American value system. And because of multiculturalism over the last half century and more, we have basically destroyed our founding value system, and that's where we have arrived. So I think that argument remains. I would hope it remains valid, that the people will start discussing this matter of what remains in the 21st century. And as this crisis expands, and as this crisis sharpens in terms of, because the globalists are not going to withdraw. No. They're not going to go into a penalty shootout. They will try to shoot out right now. There's not going to be an overtime play that after 90 minutes of soccer or 120 minutes of soccer, you say, okay, 0-0, we'll have a penalty shootout. Right. None of that. They're already gone into overdrive, and they're going to go into overdrive even more so as they see their opportunities slipping away from what they had planned for. So this is the situation we are in.
Absolutely, 100%. And so we had Hungary and then Serbia.
Yeah, both had their election last Sunday, right, on April 3rd. And both came out with results. In the Hungarian election, it was a very clear victory for Fidesz. They now dominate the parliament, and they have Fidesz as the prime minister, fourth running time. And so he's going to be there till 2025, 2026. I think it's every 5 years. So he's going to be there, and he's going to make a big difference, not only for Hungary, but also for other European countries that now has to deal with Orban. It was very, in a sense, striking to hear Orban speak. I mean, I picked it up in the media, that is, in the print media. I don't understand Hungarian to see what he was saying, but in the print media, the translation came out very loud and clear when Orban said that this victory that his party and he have received from the Hungarian people is so loud, so big, that it can be seen from the moon and it can be seen from Brussels.
Right.
So it was a massive message that was sent to Brussels, and Brussels responded also predictably. They have already declared that they are going to penalize Hungary because they have not lived up to their legal commitments to the European Commission. Right. Now, The European Commission, especially the commissioner, um, this woman from Holland, von der Leyen, um, she is saying that you have not changed your constitution to meet the 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 requirements of the European Union, and then they're going to hold back what is due to Euro funds that is due to Hungary, and they're already holding back on the money that is due to Hungary for receiving Ukrainian immigrants or refugees, because Hungary does not have signed on the European human rights requirements. And what are the European human rights requirements? It is the globalist agenda,
Right.
multiculturalism, and LGBTQ. So it is not about economics, it's not about the autonomy of individual European states, their culture, their values, their language. It is what is going to be dictated by Brussels, which is now the new headquarters of Euro-communism.
Right.
This headquarters of Soviet communism used to be Moscow. There is no longer Moscow, the headquarters of Soviet communism. Soviet communism is gone 30 years ago, but the new communism is the communism, Euro-communism, and that's where it is in Brussels. And they're going to dictate. And Mr. Urban, both before the election and after the election, was very clear that Hungary is a sovereign state, and whatever law Hungary is going to pass will not be passed by Brussels. It will be passed by the elected members of the Hungarian Assembly, that is the representative of the Hungarian people, and the representative of the Hungarian people.
And their culture.
Yeah, they don't agree with those position that the European Union want to push upon them, and they're not going to go along with it. So that's clearly, again, another sign of what a self-respecting, dignified, sovereign state is going to say to Brussels. That's exactly what the Brexit was about in 2016. Even though Boris Johnson is a thoroughly reprehensible person, but he's still the elected prime minister. He's again a conservative like Stephen Harper and Erin O'Toole and Andrew Scheer and all of that, in only a name only conservative.
Right. Exactly.
But the people of Britain, the Brexit people, they voted to get out of European Union, and the European Union have not heard that message on that issue. Same thing with Serbia. But Serbia is not a member of European Union, I mean, Serbia was basically was humiliated and defeated by NATO and European Union over Kosovo.
Right.
And Serbia remains outside of the European Union. So in that sense, those were not the issue. But what were the issue in the election on Sunday was, as a result of February 24th breakout of the Ukraine war, the issue was for Hungary directly and for Serbia indirectly to implement the European sanction, the NATO and European sanction on Russia and Moscow. And both Hungary and Serbia have rejected that. Right. In fact, immediately after the Hungarian election, Orban stated in a message that Hungary is going to buy oil and gas from Russia and will make the payment in rubles as Putin has asked for. And Hungary is very much ready to make the payments in ruble, whereas the European Union and NATO has demanded that Hungary follow those sanctions. Otherwise, Hungary will be penalized even more. And I think Orban is now in a position to say, basically, politely, you can go wherever you want. we are going to go in our own direction. In other words, Hungary will break out of that euro arrangement if necessary, and follow the new arrangement that are in the works. And we will have to come back and discuss about that, because I think there's a massive change that is going to happen either in our lifetime, my lifetime, but definitely in the lifetime of our children. That is, uh, the world is moving away, or will move away from the US dollar as the reserve currency,
Right.
international currency, and there will be new arrangements that will be coming on. And so maybe the Anglosphere, maybe Canada, parts of European Union, Britain, Australia, New Zealand will remain within that dollar arrangement.
Mhm.
But more than, 2/3 to three-quarter of the world population is going to move out of the dollar and will move into either a new gold standard, or it will become more of a equal exchange of currency that will be arranged between China, Russia, India, South Africa, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So that's a whole different set of questions that we are faced with, and we need to talk about that, because in the Canadian budget, though the Canadian media is not talking about it, that
Right.
issue has already, in a sense, been put on the table, but hidden away deep inside the budget, so that people cannot see it up front. One has to go inside and look
Right.
at the
And
situation.
the media, of course, completely ignores it.
The
Yep.
media will not, yeah, exactly, will not do
Mm.
that. So I think that is a big pushback by Orban on Brussels, the European Union, to impose one rule that fits everybody, if you're a member of the European Union,
Mm.
on its relationship with Russia. And Orban has said no. Similarly, in the case of Serbia, again, Serbia is a very small economy and a very small country. But from the point of view of sovereignty and respect of the independent state, individual
Right.
state, Serbia's position has been very clear. Serbia is not going to go along with the European Union.
Mm.
Serbia is allied with Russia. Serbian church, Serbia is a Orthodox Christianity, Greek Orthodox, and same is in the Russian. Russians are Greek Orthodox, with the Patriarchate in Moscow that has been revived after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm.
I have seen polling data uh, recently that somewhere close to 70% of the Russian population are in some sense uh, devoted to their religion, and they've
Mm.
returned to their religion. And I suppose those numbers will increase, and those sense of identity will increase as Russia becomes even more strong in terms of its own past tradition and history,
Right.
in terms
Right.
of nationalism.
Mm.
So that's the flag Russia is now carrying, and we'll see how this progresses. There is a third election, as I mentioned,
Yeah. I was just gonna bring it up.
the, the French election, and the French election is going to
Mm.
be, again, a zinger. The money, because the way the media is structured in France, and the way France is one of the founding members of the European Union, and so Brussels,
Right.
the two or three major power in the European Union today, after Britain withdrew after Brexit, is Germany, France, and Italy. So that's
Right.
the triumvirate. So in that sense, Emmanuel Macron is the favorite going into the final round. But in the first round, um, Macron will be there. He'll come out on the top because they're two-round election. If no candidate in the slate of presidential candidate win 50 plus 1% of the vote,
Mm.
then it goes into the second round. The two top candidates then will fight it out, duke it out 2 weeks later on the 24th of April. So Macron will be one of the two, and the question was who's going to be the number two. When the election season began after Christmas, a lot of eyes, including my own, as I was following the French discussion, was on Eric Zemmour, the guy who's a populist journalist who stepped forward almost like Trumpian manner, and his main agenda was basically immigration, multiculturalism, and closing the door on further downgrading of the French culture, French history. So it was a very sharp cultural program that he was putting forward and attacking Macron. But he slipped, and this Marine Le Pen, she has come up. And right now, as I checked out the popular poll over the last 24 hours or so, Macron and Le Pen are running head to head in popular poll. In fact, Marine Le Pen is within the margin of error. According to the popular poll, Macron has about 51% support, and Le Pen is around about 49%. So that's within the margin of error. And going into the second round, it could be a phenomenal race where Le Pen narrows the gap and comes out ahead. And I think a lot of people will be cheering for Le Pen. I certainly, sitting here and cheering for Le Pen, hope that Le Pen comes through. So what are the issues and what is happening in the French election? Well, the issues are, again, it happened here in Canada. We had that a couple of years ago with the Yellow Vest, which began in France, against Brussels, against climate change, and against all of that issue that came together.
Migration,
So it is straightforward French nationalism. On the right is French nationalism, that France has been degraded and shredded by this open door policy of multiculturalism going back.
But this is what happens. This is why their agenda is what it is, to destroy the nation state, and especially the states in the West. They want to destroy Western civilization and go to this globalist model, global governance and dominance and control. And so, yeah, of course, it's completely destroying, these countries like France.
Exactly, and that. But of course, it is not the first time. It is a recurring issue over the last 25, 30 years, going all the way back to 1990. If you want to take the Cold War as the dividing line of the new Europe and the old Europe, in the sense before the Cold War. So during the Cold War, there was that French nationalism still in place to some extent, whether you were on the right or whether you were on the left. In the French division, right and left is, of course, the historic figure of Charles de Gaulle, the Gaullists. And Charles de Gaulle, the French military officer, later general, was the icon of French nationalism, French sovereignty, French identity, coming out of the Second World War and into the making of the Fifth Republic, and that France will stand as one of the great Western civilization, member of the Western civilization. France is known in the historic sense as the older daughter of the church, that is the Catholic Church, and so that's the right. And then there is the other side of it, that is the French Revolution, that is the left, or socialism, and uh, in the 1990s, there was an alternation between the right and the left. The Gaullists were in control of the presidency, at least, if not the parliament, where the socialists had big numbers.
Yep.
But the last socialist president was Mitterrand, Francois Mitterrand. He was there when the Cold War ended. But since then, France has drifted more and more to that European, as both a member and a leader of the European idea of united European state. France has drifted more and more to the concept of multiculturalism, open borders, integration with Germany and other European states. And the right has been trying to push back against that, but the culture of the dominant elite in the West, and that is Europe, has been on the left. They moved to the left, and during the Cold War years, they pushed their socialist agenda both as independent states and through the European Union, once the European Union was formed in 1994, under the cover of American military security, that is NATO. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a different situation, both in the European context and in terms of the world context. And so Le Pen from the right is pushing for rethinking France's place in the post-Cold War Europe. She is the one standing for French nationalism, French sovereignty, French independence. She promises, though she has not played this message very hard, because that was the message of Eric Zemmour about immigration. She has played the other message very hard, and that is the message of independence, sovereignty, and France's own national interest. And so recently, in public discussions in the media, and talking to people who are covering her candidacy, she was asked, what is her position now that she is leading on the right, the leading candidate? What is her position if she forms the government, if she wins the election, on Europe, on NATO, on French foreign policy? Foreign policy is a big thing in the French election, unlike in Canada, because France considers it's also one of the Security Council members, right? So it's the permanent member of the Security Council, has the veto. So these are issues that are very much of concern or of discussion in the French election. So Le Pen's position, as she explained, was that where Europe is concerned, where she's concerned, the European Union is a catastrophe. She used the word catastrophe. She said European Union is a catastrophe. And what she and her government would do is to help Europe find its new balance, its new arrangement as a Europe of nations. That's a beautiful word she used, Europe as nations. That's what Europe has been, And so that's as nations, as adults, as independent, sovereign nations, you come together and you negotiate and you make your treaties and you agree and so on and so forth.
Yes.
You respect each other's traditions and values and history and so on. So I really loved her phrasing of it, Europe of nations, as opposed to the European Union, which is a Europe of Euro communists, and that is very clear. That is it's a clear division.
And I think
yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it's extremely important that we're seeing these things happening. Hungary, lesser degree Serbia, France. It's encouraging because as things move along, and this divide that we spoke of at the beginning, that's this nationalism versus globalism, it needs to be in the discussion in Canada. It needs to be at the forefront of everyone's discussion, because this is we're either heading one way or the other, and people really need to wrap their head around this whole issue and decide. Do you want the Canada that we've always had, or do you want to give it away?
100%. And how will that come about is unless people like us, as common citizens, continue to talk amongst ourselves and demand whoever wants our vote to respond to the question that we are asking openly and clearly.
Right.
Uh, because these questions are not going to be raised by the media, the globalist media, which basically controls Canadian media. And these questions are not going to be raised by the current crop of members of parliament or political parties or their leaders. So it is left to the people. And that's the lesson of Hungary, that Orban is today standing tall for the Hungarians, because Hungarians made him stand tall. He could not have stood tall on his own.
Yeah. Right.
So that's, and I think if that happens in France, it will be French people coming back in a huge way. And I hope that something like that happens.
I think it's inevitable. I think it's inevitable, Salim. I really do. Even in France or other countries too. I think it's inevitable that once a culture and a way of life is threatened, and I mean, people who have paid attention, like yourself and myself, know that it's been threatened for many decades, but we've been sounding the alarm to in large part a deaf crowd. But as more people understand that it's being threatened by this globalist agenda, more and more people are going to come and stand and defend the Canadian way of life. I just can't see it going in any other direction, just like I can't see it in other countries. I've been to Norway, and they're incredibly attached to their way of life, their language, their culture. They would never give that up for anything. And Sweden is very similar, and a lot of these European countries and a lot of countries throughout the West are like that. And so I just see it as inevitable. At some point, there's going to be a wave of nationalism, which doesn't mean you can't work with other countries, right? And of course you can, and you have to, but while maintaining everything that you cherish at home. It just, to me, it seems inevitable.
Yeah. I hope you're right. I pray that you're right. The only reason that if you are close to 100, somewhere between 90 and 100 in your optimism, I am down at 70.
Yes.
and we need to talk about it. I'm not down at 70 because I don't want to be at 100. I see immense difficulties, and I find those difficulties have been created by the leadership over here, by the elite over here.
You have to start coming on some of these town halls with me. You would feel a lot better.
Yeah, but I absolutely, and we're going to talk about this, and hopefully we'll be able to do this summer.
For sure.
But we in those town hall, we'll have to confront the people. I would have to confront the people, because that's the conversation. If you're sitting with a pack of cards and all of us are holding the same card, then there is no game.
100%.
So the issue is that why to the extent that Canada and America, and so for that matter now, that's the discussion we are having on France, has turned out to be different than, say, Viktor Orban and Hungary. Why? Because to understand the why is to find the remedy for our own situation. Right? We have to find the remedy for our own situation. And our remedy for our situation is immensely complicated. Why? Very quick answer. Hungary was not, there was an Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, but it was a European empire. The Hungarian Empire Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled over the Balkans, so it was European.
Right.
The French Empire was extra-European. The French Empire went into Africa,
Right.
into Southeast Asia,
Yes.
into Indonesia.
Mm.
So the
Mm.
French Empire was vast,
Right. As
and
was the
also
British.
into the Caribbean.
Mm.
The British Empire, the British Commonwealth now, the British Empire was huge. It was the biggest empire. The sun
Right.
never sank on the British Empire, and unfortunately, America became an empire, which went against what the founding fathers said. We discussed that last time we were
Right.
together. It
Right.
went against the words of George Washington and others, and now we can see America is an empire of lies, empire of deceit. It is Today, America is far more dangerous an empire than any other empire. I'm not comparing America to Stalinism, but
Right.
any other empire because of its immense power. And this
Mm.
power America is using on behalf of the globalists. That's the deep state. I mean, if you talk about globalism today, we are talking about America,
Mm.
because without America, the globalism cannot push their agenda.
Right.
Europe does not have the muscle to push the agenda.
Which is
Look
why
at,
they stole the election from Trump.
pardon?
Which is why they stole the election from Trump.
Just right. Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. So coming back to Macron, she was asked about NATO, and she
Mm.
said, if she becomes the president, she will withdraw France from NATO. Fantastic. And the
Huge.
question,
Huge.
why? And she answered, because NATO was a organization that was put together, a military organization that was put together during the Soviet communism to protect Europe from Soviet communism.
Mm.
Soviet communism is long gone, and the usefulness of NATO is long gone.
Right.
This was almost a De
But
Gaulle type
well,
answer.
yeah, it depends on whose perspective. Obviously, the globalists are using NATO as a means to fulfill their agenda, right? So it's not the NATO purpose is not as it once was. It's completely different in the hands of the
Exactly.
globalists now. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, but NATO is nothing without America. So what it is NATO is an American instrument now to
Mm.
push an American policy through Europe.
Right. Right.
And in Serbia, that policy was fully exposed. That is, when at the United Nations, the issue of Kosovo was an internal issue of Serbia.
Mm.
Kosovo was in a state of unrest or civil war that would eventually break out with the federal government of Serbia, that is, the capital Belgrade. Uh, Something you might say similar to what happened in 1970 in Canada when the FLQ, Federation Liberation of Quebec, rose up, started bombing, kidnapping people. This was an internal problem of Canada.
Right.
And at that time, the Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, imposed War Measures Act. Well, the issue never went to the United Nations because this is an internal problem. Canada is a sovereign country and it has to be solved internally. But in the
Right.
case of Serbia, the matter of Kosovo was taken to the UN, and it was vetoed by Russia.
Mm.
And what happened then? They took the matter from out of the UN and made it into a European issue with NATO. And NATO was then given the authority to bomb Serbia. And that's
Right.
what NATO did. NATO bombed Serbia. Now, NATO is an organization. NATO is not a country.
Right.
So United Nations had no control over NATO. And NATO was used to bomb Serbia and to break Serbia. Just as NATO was used to bomb Libya and break Libya. So
Right.
this is where Le Pen is. Le Pen is being very honest and very straightforward that France will pull out of NATO, which is exactly what de Gaulle did. De Gaulle pulled France out of NATO, and after de Gaulle died, the subsequent presidents of France, I think it was Pompidou, who brought France back into NATO. So, very interesting answer that she gave. And in explaining her position on NATO and Europe, she said very clearly, she said, my position is the same as Mr. Trump, President Trump, and Mr. Putin. So this was an amazing public, open statement by the leading candidate, the leading opposition candidate in the French presidential election, mentioning by name both President Trump and President Putin. That must have gotten the people in Brussels all in a knot, very agitated.
So, Salim, do you know the Le Pen party? Do you know how many seats they have in Parliament there in France? Like, do they have an effective? Are they the opposition, or do they have an effective?
No, they don't. They have a few seats, but they don't have enough seats because it is the party that is Macron's party, Marc, and the Socialist Party. They are in control of the Parliament.
Okay.
So no, they don't have that many seats, but they have representation, and they have representation also in the European Parliament and Strasbourg. So I think Marie Le Pen herself, I could be wrong. It has to be checked out, but I have a feeling, if my memory serves me, that she had sat in the European Parliament for a couple of years before she came back. But this is her third attempt to win the presidency. Maybe it might be the final attempt. So we'll see what happens. But here is the difficult part of it in the French election. What has happened in the last 30 years? Open door immigration has radically changed France as it has changed Canada.
Right.
The Muslim population in France from a North African and African Middle Eastern country is now roughly 10% of the population. And then there are areas where it is even larger. Then there is the immigration from Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and that too is a very significant number. So these numbers mean that they can be the vote, which we might call the swing vote, that can shape the nature of election. So if it seems that Marie Le Pen is very close to winning, these numbers can come together and put the other side on top.
Right.
So that's the huge issue. And also what has happened is the radical secularization of France has brought about over the last half a century or so, just as in Quebec, has brought about a big shift from the traditional values of France as a Christian Catholic country, with the whole question of LGBTQ, the whole question of abortion, same-sex marriage, and all of that has changed the nature of what used to be de Gaulle's country when de Gaulle was the president, or after the Second World War. So those are the issues that we have to deal. Hungary doesn't have that problem, because France was an empire. The empire being extra-European, the people of the empire have come back to France and they make a big number. That's not the case in Hungary. That's not the case in Romania. That's not the case in Serbia. That is the case in Italy, by the way. The Italians have to deal with that problem of how to create a national consensus And what the European Union has done, this is what Canadian federalism is doing, is using immigration and social welfare to corrupt the body politics of the country, and which is
Yeah.
exactly what the Americans are doing.
100%. Yep.
And so
Absolutely.
the challenges are in that sense very different. So as I said it right at the outset, the Canadian, I mean, we say Canadian, we're not talking hyphenated Canadian, but multiculturalism is about hyphenation, right? So Japanese Canadian, Indian
Right.
Canadian,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth, German Canadian. So this hyphenated identity means that by design, the federal government and the elite want to keep Canada a divided country along ethnic lines, so that a national consensus cannot come together.
Right. 100%. Absolutely. And one would argue, in fact, that would be and should be considered racist, but somehow we always end up being the racist.
Precisely, but that's again something that people have to stand up to. Just as
Yes.
I think what is happening now in American politics is because the American Constitution gives weight to the Bill of Rights, that individual, rights and liberty, which
Yeah.
the Canadian Constitution, I would now openly say, the Canadian Constitution is a big hoax. With
Yes.
all due respect to Brian Peckford, a man whom I respect,
Yep.
he's the last remaining member of that group of premiers that negotiated the Charter of Rights and Freedom. They never understood the problem. They never understood the world in which they were engaged in this discussion.
Right.
They took Mr. Pierre Trudeau in an honorable way, that he's the Prime Minister of Canada and we will negotiate all of these things. But Mr. Pierre Trudeau was a Marxist.
Absolutely. And he set it up. He set it up as is.
Yeah, while he appeared as a liberal and all of that, he was a hardcore Marxist, and he played the premiers, in a manner that the premiers could never rise up to. He proved to be far more astute and shrewd, and he was not alone. It was the Laurentian elite, and the sellout had begun before Pierre Trudeau. That is, the Laurentian elite had taken control of the liberal agenda, and then the conservative was bought into that liberal agenda, and so there is no voice to challenge that issue, and our premiers have totally failed. There has been not a single premier that has stood up for their provinces or for Canada.
Right. And you can be very proud, because I think we're probably the only channel or podcast in Canada that actually talks about these things. So congratulations. I've yet to hear anyone else discuss these things the way that we do. And so, let's carry on.
Well, it was a Marxist term that Mr. Pierre Trudeau very slyly put into play, that is, the Liberal Party under him put into play, that you are not politically correct. And people will say, why are we not politically correct? And so start thinking about it. So that whole language of political correctness was to shape the dialogue, was to shape the conversation, And so anybody, when saying things, and somebody said you're not politically correct, went into the defensive instead of saying what is not politically correct about this. Who are you to decide what is politically correct?
Exactly.
And so our entire education system, our conversation, beginning way back in the 1970s, late 60s and early 70s, which is now more than half century, have shaped the thinking of people in a certain way that they do not then question that thinking, because to question it would become politically incorrect. So when Mr. Lester Pearson, and this is why I emphasize history is so important, but we Canadians, And Americans even in a bigger way, because it's a much bigger country and a far more powerful country, uh, have very little historical knowledge. I mean, there is so often I run into American, who are university graduates who are in position of responsibility and authority, who cannot make a difference, between Iraq and Iran, even though the Americans have waged war in the Middle
Right.
East over the last 30 years. Which
Right.
is Iraq and which is Iran? They cannot make any difference. They don't know what it is. And it's supposed to be a global power, the global superpower. So lack of historical knowledge. So when Lester Pearson, in 1960, said, that led up to the Bilingual and Bicultural Commission, said that the founding culture of Canada is English and French. And so that became the politically correct framing of the conversation and the
Right.
history, English and French. It was a complete lie. Canada's founding culture is not English and French. English and French fought for Canada in the 18th century, in the 17th century.
Right.
The English were fighting the French were fighting the English, and finally the English defeated the French in 1759. Then, after defeating the French, then the English made certain moves to try to build a relationship in which they would not have to continue that fight, that they had conquered it.
Right.
To be honest, then would have required Mr. Pearson to say Canada is an immigrant country of which the dominant immigrant culture is English, because that's our language. That is the language of the 13 colonies. The Spanish, the French, they were defeated in North America. And so, by Mr. Pearson telling an open lie that nobody challenged, he was the prime minister.
Yeah.
Then he hands power to Pierre Trudeau, who becomes the prime minister, and he uses that lie to do what? To demand a 50-50 arrangement between English and French in terms of language, that there will be one language, bilingual country, 50-50, which in effect become 80-20, because barely 20% of English can speak French,
Right.
and 80% of the French speaks English. So we are a federation in which 20% of the country runs 80% of the country. And I'm a proud man who happens to say that, because I came and I studied this issue in the last years of my life. And of course, nobody's going to discuss this, so I can discuss it with you, Mark, on your platform.
Yes,
But
please.
anywhere else, whether it is National Post, Globe and Mail, CBC, they might not call me a bigot, but they will just, politically incorrect dismiss the discussion.
Yep. 100%. Yes, my friend. It's an hour now, and I'd like to actually save this episode as it is and call it a night. But another great discussion. And once again, I appreciate you taking the time on your Friday night to join me and join us and do your thing. Fantastic.
Well, it's a pleasure, Mark. I mean, so much is happening, and we are at a critical time.
I can't wait until we can do this together in person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will be more than happy to come and join you for a trip in the West.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Sounds good. All right, my friend.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Have a good night.
Yep.
All right. Another round with Salim. Smart man. We're so lucky to have him. He's a national treasure, that man. So, yeah, my pleasure. If you're on YouTube, remember to subscribe, because I'm rebuilding. I think this is the third or fourth time on YouTube. It'd be nice to get back to 11,000 subs, but, whatever. But if you're watching and you haven't subbed, then by all means, please subscribe and like. and all that other good stuff. Facebook, I'm still on Canada First, and Mark Friesen, Saskatoon Grasswood. I got another month on probation before Facebook allow me to go live on my other platform. But yeah, it's all good. We'll get there. And I am live on Odyssey right now. I'm also live on D-Live, of course, and Twitch as well. So anyways, that's going to be a wrap for tonight. We're heading to Swift Current tomorrow afternoon. We'll be there at 5:30 to have some dinner with some folks, and then the event is at 7 o'clock. Just pull it up here again. 7 o'clock at the E Center, 885 6th Avenue Northeast in Swift Current. We'll see you there if you're going to be there. Yeah, one of these nights, Paulette, I'll just bring Salim on to do a Q&A, and we'll just do that. But anyways, see you in Swift Current tomorrow night, folks. And I'll be live, I think, on Sunday night with Sean Taylor. We're going to talk about the prospects of revolution, Canadian Revolution, and how some people think it's going to go kinetic, and we think that's a bad idea, and we'll tell you why. Yeah. Anyways, it should be an interesting discussion, so we'll see you Sunday night if we don't see you in Swift Current tomorrow. And remember, globalism, bad. Nationalism, good. All right. Ciao for now. Hey, shush. Not yet. All right.
One day, one day, one day, I hope you see the truth. This puppet show stays on because of you fools. We've been dancing with the devil way too long. I know it's fun, but get ready to pay your dues. Oh God, come back home. This crazy world is filled with liars and abusers. We need you now before we're too far gone. I hope one day they finally see the truth. God, we need you now.